April 4th, 431 BC, Plataea, an allied city of Athens, sometime in the early hours before dawn, an armed detachment from Thebes, an ally of Sparta, entered through the city gates in a surprise strike. It wasn't a formal declaration of war. It was the first move in a game that would last 27 years and tear the classical Greek world apart from the inside out. And you, a 32-year-old Athenian citizen with a small property in Attica and children at home, have just woken up to the news. In less than 80 days, the army of the Spartan king Archidamus II will be burning your crops in full view of your own city walls. The Peloponnesian War isn't just the greatest war of ancient Greece. It's the conflict that Thucydides, the historian who lived through every year of it, called the greatest upheaval that the Greeks, and part of the barbarian world, nearly the whole world, had ever suffered. Not because it was the bloodiest in open battle, but because it destroyed conventions that had, until then, limited the barbarity of war, the immunity of civilians, respect for neutrals, proportionality in response. Over 27 years, rules that had stood for centuries were abandoned one by one, and the first day was the moment when everything you knew as normal stopped being guaranteed. This video is going to put you inside that first day, not in the role of a general or a king, in the role of an ordinary Athenian citizen, a farmer, a craftsman, a father, who woke up on that April morning in 431 BC and had to make decisions he never imagined he'd have to make. Each segment will present a specific reality of that day and ask you directly, what would you do? What would your instinct tell you? Before we start, an immediate decision. You're Athenian, you've got family at home, and you've just learned that the Spartan army has crossed into Attica. Pericles has just announced the strategy. No one fights outside the walls. Everyone abandons the countryside and moves into the city. Do you obey and let your farm be burned without a fight? Or do you try to hide your livestock, your crops, and your family before heading in? Comment with obey or resist. Either way, it's going to cost you something. I'll tell you the price in both cases. If you're into history told from the inside out, without academic distance, subscribe now and hit like. Let's step into this day together. Once you heard about it in the Agora, not from an official messenger, from a man coming back from a trip to the north who saw the smoke in the distance, in the direction of Plataea, and heard what had happened the night before. In Athens in 431 BC, news traveled at the speed of human legs and the efficiency of conversation networks in the public square. Within hours, the entire city knew, and what the city knew was precise enough to terrify anyone with a sense of reality. Thebes had attacked Plataea, the war was formally underway, and the army of King Archidamus was assembling in the Peloponnese for the invasion of Attica. The first reaction recorded in the texts of the time wasn't heroism, it was calculation. Athenian farmers with property outside the walls immediately began assessing what they could move into the city before the enemy army arrived. Pericles had prepared the assembly for this moment. For years he had warned that, in a war against Sparta, the Athenian strategy would be not to fight outside the walls, but to use naval supremacy to attack the coasts of the Peloponnese, while the enemy burned the Attic countryside without strategic gain. It was solid logic on paper. It was psychologically devastating in practice. Thucydides recorded the emotional state of the city with clinical precision. Athenians who owned rural property left behind houses, farms, and what he called the customs and way of life inherited from their ancestors. Many families who had lived in their dems, the rural communities of Attica, for generations had to settle into an urban space overcrowded with refugees. The long walls connecting Athens to the port of Piraeus became the perimeter of the habitable world. And inside that perimeter, 100,000 people who normally didn't share the same space now shared every water source, every patch of shade, every available portion of food. The call-up came the way it always did in Athens, through the herald of the assembly, who went through the demes announcing the names of the men summoned for service. You were 32, within the conscription range that ran from 18 to 60. You had hoplite equipment your father had left you and that you had maintained. Because being a hoplite was both a civic obligation and a marker of social status in Athens. The practical, immediate problem was this. You had about 3 hours between receiving the call and needing to be at the muster point with full equipment. 3 hours to organize your family, give instructions to your wife about what to do with the property, say goodbye to your children, and tighten the bronze harness that might be the last outfit you ever wore. The equipment weighed between 20 and 25 kilos. Putting on the cuirass alone was difficult. Most hoplites needed someone to tighten the straps at the back. In that practical, almost mundane moment of asking your wife to fasten the bronze straps across your back, something shifted. It wasn't political theory about Pericles' strategy anymore. Oh, it was cold bronze against your skin on a spring day, and the physical realization that what came next was real and irreversible. Thucydides describes the departure of Athenian hoplites for the first campaigns of the war in language that suggests exactly that. That the moment of departure, seen up close, had an emotional weight no assembly speech had prepared anyone to feel. You would form up in the phalanx with the men of your dem, neighbors, relatives, the baker on the corner, the potter down the street. Organization by dem created real cohesion. You fought alongside people you knew by name, whose families you knew, and that proximity was both a source of courage and a form of responsibility that didn't exist in combat among strangers. Running away in front of your neighbor was different from running away in front of someone you didn't know. The social weight was part of the equipment. Pericles was right. That's the hardest part of the first day of the Peloponnesian War for any modern or ancient person to fully grasp. The strategy chosen by Athens' most respected leader was logically sound and psychologically unbearable at the same time. The idea was not to fight in open battle, to let the Spartan army burn the Attic countryside without direct response, and to use the fleet to strike the coasts of the Peloponnese with fast raids. It was a long-term war of attrition strategy that depended on one specific thing, that the Athenians could endure watching their own farms burn without leaving the walls to fight. Thucydides documented what happened when the Spartans first came within sight of Athens' walls in 431 BC and began devastating the countryside of the Dem of Acharni, one of the largest and most populated in Attica. The Acharnians, Athenian citizens whose farms were being destroyed in real time, went to the assembly demanding that Pericles let the army march out and fight. The pressure was enormous. Men who had fought at Marathon and Salamis, whose identity was built around martial courage, stood on the walls watching the destruction of their own property and felt it as a humiliation that any normal human instinct would demand to answer with immediate action. Pericles refused. He didn't call an assembly. He knew that if the issue were put to a vote in that emotional moment, popular pressure would override strategic logic. He simply didn't call it. And the Spartans, who were expecting to provoke exactly the pitched battle their phalanx would win easily, spent 3 weeks burning farms with no strategic result and then left. The strategy worked in the first year, but that first year left a psychological scar on the city that Pericles had not fully calculated, and that the epidemic the following year would tear open beyond repair. Back to the hook from the beginning. Did you choose obey or resist? Now that you understand Pericles' strategy and what it cost in practice, do you stick with your answer? If you resisted, the price was losing property and risking capture, trying to save what was yours. If you obeyed, the price was watching your farm burn from the walls without being able to do anything. There was no choice without a cost. One comment which price you'd pay. Inside the walls of Athens, the situation was nothing like what any refugee had imagined. The city had been built for its permanent urban population, estimated at around 40,000 people within the walls. With the evacuation of the Attic countryside, more than 100,000 additional people arrived, carrying whatever they could transport, with animals, with children, trying to find space in a city that simply didn't have enough room for everyone. Thucydides described the result with a specific image. People sleeping in towers, in sanctuaries, in any covered space available. The area between the long walls, the corridor connecting Athens to the port of Piraeus, was filled with improvised camps. The human density that formed in Athens in the summer of 431 and intensified in the summer of 430 with the second Spartan invasion, created the perfect conditions for what came next. The epidemic. The plague of Athens, in which Thucydides described, with the precision of someone who survived it and became immune, arrived through the port of Piraeus, likely coming from Egypt through trade routes. It spread through a city whose population density had doubled or tripled in a matter of months. The epidemic wiped out between a quarter and a third of Athens' population in 2 years, including Pericles himself in 429 BC, and it turned what was supposed to be a demonstration of Athenian strategic superiority into an existential crisis the city never fully recovered from. You, an ordinary citizen living in an improvised space between the long walls with your family, would face this without vaccines and without antibiotics, without any understanding of how disease transmission worked. Thucydides documented the symptoms with striking medical precision: intense fever, inflammation in the eyes, skin eruptions, diarrhea, exhaustion. And he documented something even more disturbing: that the fear of the disease broke the social fabric of the city faster than any Spartan army could. People who cared for the sick died, and those who survived began to feel a kind of moral impunity, the sense that, having escaped the worst, the normal rules no longer applied to them. The sun sets over Athens on the first day of the Peloponnesian War. You're inside the walls. Your farm is probably being prepared to be burned or already has been. You formed up with your unit, once you received positioning instructions on the walls in case of an attack that didn't come today, and spent the last hours on alert with no immediate outcome. The enemy didn't show up today, they will, and probably in 60 or 70 days, when Archidamus' army crosses into Attica in full formation. What you saw today will feel like the calm version of what's coming. What you would carry home that night, if home still existed in the way you knew it, would be a very specific realization that Thucydides identified as one of the deepest effects of any prolonged war. The sense that the future is no longer predictable, that the certainties you built your life on, the farm your father left you, the harvest that would fund your daughter's marriage, the routine of the agora, your neighbors, even the religious festivals, all of those certainties are now conditional, dependent on how the war unfolds, on whether Pericles is right, on whether Sparta runs out of resources before Athens runs out of morale. 27 years later, the answer came. Athens capitulated. The long walls were torn down. The fleet was dismantled. Democracy was temporarily abolished by the 30 tyrants installed by Sparta. Nothing you imagined on that first day of April, 431 BC, matched what the world looked like in 404 BC. And Thucydides, writing his history as all of this was happening, asked the question that still doesn't have a definitive answer. Could it have been different? Was there a moment when a different decision would have changed the outcome? Was the war inevitable, as he himself suggested at the beginning, in that the fear Sparta felt toward the growth of Athens was the real cause? Or was it the result of specific choices made by specific people at specific moments that could have gone another way? That question has no answer in Thucydides' text, and it remains open. The first day of the Peloponnesian War had no pitched battle. There was no clash of phalanxes, no hero charging alone into the enemy, none of the moments epics promise when they describe war. There was news arriving through the agora in the morning. There was a man tightening bronze straps across his back, while his wife tried not to show what she was feeling. There was a child asking when his father would come back and not getting an honest answer. There were farmers looking at their own land and calculating what they could save in 3 hours. What would you survive the first day of the Peloponnesian War? Probably. The first day didn't kill anyone in Athens. But would you want to run? Almost certainly, because running is the instinct of any normal human being when faced with a threat that has no clear dimensions, that arrives as news in the early morning, that will last longer than anyone present that day could imagine. The instinct to run isn't cowardice, it's survival intelligence. What Athenian citizens did that day, instead of running, was something much harder. They stayed. They obeyed a strategy that required watching their own world burn without reacting. And they paid a heavy price for that restraint. Thucydides wrote about this war so future generations would understand what happens when two systems of power reach a point where neither can back down without appearing weak. That mechanism doesn't expire, And that's why the first day of the Peloponnesian War is still the first day of any war that begins the same way, with news arriving in the morning and someone who has to leave home with bronze on their back, not knowing when they'll return. In the next video, we're diving into the Athenian epidemic of 430 BC with the depth it deserves. What Thucydides described, what modern geneticists identified in the skeletons found in the Keramakos cemetery in 2006, and how a disease turned a war Athens was winning into its downfall.